Hospital CEO shot the young nurse 5 times in the hallway after surgery. What happened next is unbelievable. The night shift at St. Alban Memorial was almost over when chaos erupted. Moments after saving a patient's life, young nurse Teresa Reed stepped into the hallway only to face the hospital's most powerful man, CEO Dr. Warren. What began as a normal evening turned into a nightmare of betrayal and bloodshed. 5 shots shattered the silence, leaving the hospital frozen in disbelief. But what happened after those gunshots would change everything. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and also let us know where you're watching from in the comments. And also don't forget to download your copy of the audiobook titled 50 Powerful Prayers for Healing, Deliverance, and Breakthrough by clicking the link in the pinned comment below. Enjoy the story. The day was coming to an end when it all happened. Teresa got off from the operation room exhausted and was ready to go home. Little did she know that would be her final moment in that hospital. What followed next changed her life forever. The golden hue of evening sunlight spilled through the wide glass windows of St. Alban Memorial Hospital, painting the corridors in soft amber tones. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and lavender hand wash, a combination so ordinary it felt almost comforting. Nurses exchanged polite smiles, monitors beeped in rhythm, and the day's rush was finally beginning to fade. Teresa, still wearing her scrubs, exhaled deeply as she slipped off her gloves and placed the used instruments into the sterilization tray. The surgery had been long but successful. Another patient saved, another day of purpose fulfilled. She stretched her neck, feeling the stiffness set in after hours on her feet. Her colleagues passed by, some waving goodbye, others hurrying to finish paperwork before the next shift. Everything seemed perfectly normal, the kind of calm that comes only at the end of a long, demanding day. Yet, beneath that calm, something in the air felt heavy, like the quiet before a thunderstorm. Teresa couldn't name it, but a faint unease brushed against her thoughts, lingering just long enough to make her glance down the empty hallway. She brushed it aside. Hospitals were full of strange energy, hope, fear, life, and loss tangled together in a rhythm that never truly slept. She'd learned to ignore that uneasy feeling years ago. She gathered her charts and walked toward the nurse's station, offering a tired smile to a junior intern, fumbling nervously with a tray of medications. "Breathe," Teresa said softly. "It's just a routine dose, not a ticking bomb." The intern chuckled awkwardly, visibly relieved. That was Teresa. Steady hands, calm voice, the nurse everyone turned to when panic threatened to spill into chaos. She was known not only for her skill, but also for her heart. She remembered every patient's name, every fear whispered through trembling lips, and every tear shed by worried families. As she signed off her final chart for the day, she caught sight of a reflection in the polished glass of a medicine cabinet. Dr. Warren, the hospital CEO, was standing at the end of the hallway. His sharp suit contrasted against the pale walls, his expression unreadable. Teresa had always found him distant but professional. Tonight, however, there was something different in his eyes, something cold, almost hollow. Their gazes met for a moment. The air between them seemed to thicken. Teresa gave a polite nod, expecting him to pass by, but he didn't. Instead, he stood there for a second too long, his jaw tight, his eyes darting briefly toward the closed office doors on the opposite side of the corridor. She couldn't hear his thoughts, but instinct told her that whatever weighed on him had nothing to do with medicine. There was tension there, silent and strange. "Long day," Teresa said, trying to break the unease with casual words. Dr. Warren's lips twitched into something that resembled a smile, but it never reached his eyes. "Longer than you know," he murmured almost to himself before turning and walking away. A chill ran down Teresa's spine. She brushed it off once more, chalking it up to fatigue. She had no idea those would be the last words she would ever hear from him before the world she knew collapsed into chaos. She finished her rounds, handed in her reports, and began tidying her workspace. The soft hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence as the hospital night crew prepared to take over. Teresa glanced at the clock. 7:42 p.m. Just a few more minutes and she'd be heading home. She stacked her papers neatly, thinking about her cat waiting by the window and the dinner she'd probably skip out of exhaustion. And then it happened. A sound broke the fragile calm. A loud metallic click that echoed down the corridor. Teresa froze, her hands still on the stack of charts. The sound was followed by something sharper, deafening. One gunshot, then another. The air shattered into panic. At the far end of the hallway, Dr. Warren stood motionless. His face contorted with rage and despair. His arm was extended, a gun trembling in his grasp. Time seemed to slow as Teresa's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. Her breath caught in her throat. For a split second, she thought it was some horrible mistake, a nightmare she'd soon wake from. But then came the second shot, and the third, each one tearing through the silence with merciless finality. Screams erupted from every direction. Nurses ducked behind counters. Doctors threw themselves to the floor. And the rhythmic beeping of machines was drowned out by chaos. Teresa stumbled backward, the sharp sting of pain tearing through her side. She fell to her knees, confusion and disbelief clouding her vision. The sterile white walls blurred into streaks of red as her charts scattered across the floor. Her thoughts spun wildly. Why? That single question echoed louder than the gunshots. She had never wronged him. She had no idea what he was running from. What monster within him had snapped? Dr. Warren's expression wavered between fury and terror, his breathing uneven. For a brief second, he seemed to realize what he'd done. His eyes met Teresa's again. Only this time, they weren't filled with authority or pride. They were hollow, desperate, lost. 5 shots, then silence. The gun clattered to the floor as Warren turned and disappeared down the corridor. Nurses rushed forward, calling for help, their voices trembling. The hall was a blur of motion. Hands pressing down on wounds, phones dialing emergency codes, the sharp scent of blood mixing with antiseptic. Teresa's vision dimmed at the edges, her body fighting to stay conscious. Her colleague, Dr. Patel, knelt beside her, shouting orders she could barely hear. "Stay with me, Teresa. Stay with me." She tried to speak, but only managed a faint whisper. Her world was slipping away. Every sound muffled, every face fading above her. The ceiling lights blurred into halos, flickering like distant stars. Somewhere in the distance, alarms wailed. The hospital, her sanctuary, her second home, had turned into a battlefield. The floor she had once walked with confidence were now stained with the proof of human fragility and betrayal. As she was lifted onto a stretcher, a single tear slipped down her cheek, more from disbelief than pain. She wasn't afraid of dying. What terrified her was not knowing why this had happened. Why the man trusted to protect lives had just tried to destroy hers. As the gurney wheels rolled toward the emergency unit, her heartbeat slowed but didn't stop. Somewhere deep inside her fading consciousness, a spark remained. A promise that if she lived, she would uncover the truth behind the horror that had just unfolded in the heart of St. Alban Memorial Hospital. And as the doors swung shut behind her, the once calm hallway stood in stunned silence. The echoes of those 5 shots hanging heavy in the air, a haunting reminder that even the safest places can hide the darkest storms. The world blurred into streaks of white and red. As the gurney raced down the corridor, Teresa's blood trailed behind her, leaving a crimson path across the polished tiles. The same hall she had walked with quiet confidence only minutes before now echoed with the chaos of desperate footsteps and urgent voices. Every sound seemed distant. The rapid click of wheels, the barked orders, the faint rhythmic beeping of a monitor keeping time with her fading pulse. Pressure's dropping, someone shouted. "We're losing her." But Teresa heard none of it clearly. In her mind, everything moved in slow motion. The fluorescent lights above her became a tunnel of blinding stars, each flash fading further away. Her body was weightless, detached, as if she were floating just above herself, watching the frantic scene unfold. The doors to the operating room burst open, the same room she had left not long ago, tired but content after a long day's work. Now she was the one on the table, pale, motionless, her own scrubs cut away by trembling hands. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Teresa, the nurse who had saved countless lives, was now fighting for her own. Dr. Patel, her closest colleague, took command. His voice, usually calm and reassuring, was sharp and strained. "I need suction. Give me more units of O-negative now." Sweat dripped down his forehead as he worked, his gloved hands moving with precision born of panic. Around him, a team of doctors and nurses, people Teresa had guided and trained, moved with grim determination. The heart monitor blared a warning. A flatline threatened to silence the room. "Don't you dare give up on me, Teresa," Patel muttered under his breath. "Not tonight." Outside the OR, chaos reigned. Police officers flooded the lobby. Yellow tape cordoned off the main hallway, and security staff ushered terrified patients back to their rooms. Reporters had already caught wind of the story, their vans forming a wall of flashing lights outside the emergency entrance. No one could believe it. Dr. Warren, the hospital's respected CEO, had shot one of his own nurses. The man who once spoke about compassion, innovation, and healing was now barricaded inside his office, refusing to speak, refusing to surrender. Inside, though, there was only one mission to bring Teresa back. Her pulse flickered on the screen, faint, but there. A murmur of hope rippled through the team. Dr. Patel pressed forward. "We've got a pulse. Let's stabilize her. Keep it steady." The air in the room was thick with tension. Every second felt borrowed. Every breath of battle. Teresa's mind drifted in and out of consciousness. Her thoughts a haze of half-formed memories and sensations. She saw faces. Her mother's gentle smile. Her younger brother laughing. The intern she had mentored, their eyes bright with admiration. And then she saw Dr. Warren's face. That last look of anguish and fury before the shots rang out. Why had he done it? The question hung in the darkness of her fading awareness, unanswered, burning. Her body convulsed as another wave of pain tore through her. The surgical lights seemed to grow brighter, almost blinding. Somewhere in the background, Dr. Patel's voice broke through again, distant yet familiar. "We're not losing her. Not on my watch." Time lost its meaning. Minutes stretched into hours. Each one an eternity of uncertainty. Outside, detectives negotiated through the door of Warren's office. Inside, blood transfusions flowed, machines beeped, and the room pulsed with urgency. Teresa's lungs struggled against the ventilator. Her heart fought to remember its rhythm. Then, at last, the chaos inside the orb began to quiet. Her vital signs steadied. The once erratic beeping of the monitor found a fragile consistency. Relief rippled through the room like a silent prayer. Dr. Patel removed his gloves, exhausted. "She's not out of the woods yet," he whispered. "But she's fighting." One by one, the staff stepped back, their faces pale and strewn with sweat. Some cried quietly, others simply stood still, staring at the woman who had become the heart of their hospital. Teresa's survival was not just a medical victory. It was an act of defiance against tragedy itself. Hours later, in the dim quiet of the ICU, Teresa lay motionless beneath the soft glow of the monitors. Tubes and wires framed her face, but her chest rose and fell steady and sure. Outside her room, the hospital buzzed with disbelief. Whispers filled every corridor. "She's alive," they said. "They saved her." The words carried through the building like a collective exhale. Reporters were already demanding answers. How could a respected CEO commit such violence? What had driven him to such madness? Inside his locked office, Dr. Warren sat in silence. The police negotiators spoke through the door, their voices patient, cautious. Through the blinds, his shadow remained still. No one knew whether he would surrender peacefully or add another tragedy to the night's horrors. Back in the ICU, Dr. Patel stood by Teresa's bedside. As detectives escorted Warren away hours later, the staff gathered silently by the windows. The man who had once led them through medical milestones now walked in handcuffs, his expression vacant. The weight of betrayal lingered heavier than the scent of antiseptic in the air. Meanwhile, Teresa continued to breathe slowly, painfully but alive. Her fight between life and death had ended not in silence, but in resilience. Her pulse, once faint and fleeting, now echoed like a declaration that the darkness had not won. By evening, the news had spread far beyond the hospital walls. Nurse survives after being shot by hospital CEO, the headlines read. But within those sterile rooms, those who had witnessed the night's horror knew the truth was deeper. Teresa's survival was not just medical. It was symbolic. It was a reminder that even in the face of cruelty and chaos, life, courage, and the human spirit could endure. And as the monitors continued their steady rhythm, each beep was more than a sign of recovery. It was a quiet promise that justice, truth, and healing would follow. Rain drummed softly against the hospital windows, a rhythmic whisper that filled Teresa's dimly lit room. Days had passed since the shooting, yet the events replayed in her mind in sharp, haunting fragments. The sterile smell of antiseptic, the echo of gunfire, the shocked faces of her colleagues. It all lingered like a shadow that refused to leave. Mara leaned forward. Did he mention anyone's name? She shook her head. No, but he said something else, something like, if this leaks, everything we've built is gone. Those words had bothered her ever since. But she'd pushed them aside. It wasn't her place. She had told herself. Then she was a nurse, not a detective. Now she realized that conversation might have been the beginning of everything. As the investigation deepened, new layers of deception began to surface. The hospital's financial department had flagged discrepancies. Millions siphoned from research grants, equipment budgets, and patient care funds. Hidden bank accounts linked to shell companies appeared in offshore records, all tracing back to Warren's signature. He hadn't just been running a hospital. He had been running an empire built on fraud and manipulation. In one chilling discovery, investigators found encrypted files on Warren's private computer. When decrypted, they revealed years of falsified financial reports, fake vendor payments, and evidence that patient care funds had been diverted into personal accounts. Worse still, the corruption was widespread. Other executives had turned a blind eye, benefiting in silence. When Marlowe returned with the evidence, Teresa felt a cold wave of anger. All this time, she said softly, he stood there talking about ethics and compassion while stealing from the very people we were trying to help. Marlowe nodded grimly. Greed hides well behind good intentions. But the investigation wasn't complete without her. Teresa's recollections, the overheard phone call, the documents she remembered filing, the subtle shifts in Warren's demeanor formed the human thread that tied the evidence together. Her statement turned scattered facts into a story the public could understand. One that exposed Warren not as a stressed executive, but as a man cornered by his own lies. The day she gave her formal testimony, the conference room buzzed with quiet tension. A microphone sat in front of her. A recorder blinking red. Across the table, detectives and legal advisors listened intently. Teresa sat upright, her posture steady despite the bandages still covering her wounds. I don't think he ever planned to hurt anyone, she began, her voice calm, but edged with sorrow. But when people like him feel the walls closing in, they make choices out of fear. He wasn't just afraid of losing his position. He was afraid of losing the illusion of control. When I walked into that hallway, I think he saw the truth staring back at him, and he couldn't face it. Every word she spoke painted a clearer picture of what had led to that violent moment. The recordings, the emails, the missing funds, all of it had spiraled until the facade cracked. Warren had been desperate to keep his secret buried. And when he thought some might expose him, panic had taken over reason. By the time the case went public, the nation was captivated. News anchors replayed Teresa's testimony. Analysts debated the psychology behind Warren's downfall, and social media erupted with support for the young nurse who had survived not just bullets, but betrayal. The story became more than a scandal. It was a symbol of courage in the face of corruption. Outside the hospital, protests formed, demanding transparency in healthcare systems. Patients and families who had once trusted Warren's leadership felt deceived. Their faith in the institution shattered. But amid the outrage, Teresa's resilience became a beacon. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a voice for truth. In her room, flowers piled on the windowsill. Some from strangers, others from patients she had cared for. Each note carried the same message. Thank you for speaking up. But behind the public admiration was still a private question that haunted her nights. When the bailiff called the courtroom to order, he didn't flinch. The prosecution began with precision. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the lead attorney's voice rang out. Today, you will hear the truth behind the polished image of Dr. Alan Warren, a man who claimed to heal, but instead built his power on deception, greed, and violence. Screens flickered to life, displaying ledgers, falsified reports, and offshore accounts. Proof of millions stolen from the very institution meant to save lives. The audience murmured as documents were read aloud, fraudulent research grants, inflated supply costs, and payments made to companies that didn't exist. The sheer magnitude of his crimes painted a picture more shocking than anyone had expected. The defense countered, their tone soft, rehearsed, pleading. Dr. Warren, they said, is not a monster. He is a man who broke under impossible pressure. A man who dedicated his life to medicine only to lose himself to the burden of leadership. The shooting, the lawyer paused, glancing toward Teresa, was not premeditated violence. It was the act of a mind unraveling. But the evidence told another story. It spoke in numbers, in signatures, in recorded phone calls. It spoke louder than excuses ever could. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for, Teresa's testimony. The courtroom fell silent as she rose from her seat. Her steps were measured, steady, despite the lingering pain in her body. Every whisper faded as she took the stand and raised her right hand. The oath sounded almost sacred. When she sat, the weight of countless eyes pressed down on her, but she didn't waver. The prosecutor approached. Reed, he began. Can you tell the court what you remember from the day of the shooting? Her voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of the room.
It was the end of my shift, she said.
I was tired but relieved. The surgery had gone well. I was just organizing my charts when I saw him. Her gaze flicked toward Warren for the briefest moment, then returned to the jury. He didn't say a word, not one. Then he fired. A ripple of tension moved through the spectators. The defense objected to the emotional weight of her words, but the judge overruled them. Teresa continued. I thought I was going to die, she said softly. But even more than that, I couldn't understand why. Later, when I learned about the fraud, it made sense. Not in a way that justified it, but in a way that showed how far he'd fallen. He didn't shoot me because I wronged him. He shot me because he couldn't face the truth. Her words hung in the air, cutting through the courtroom's heavy silence like a blade. For the first time, Warren's head dropped. His hands, once steady and confident, now trembled on the table before him. The prosecutor nodded gently. Ms. Reed, if you could say anything to Dr. Warren now, what would it be? Teresa hesitated. A dozen emotions flickered in her eyes. Alden Memorial Hospital, washing the white walls in warmth and gold. The air was different now, calmer, softer, alive again. Months had passed since the night that changed everything. The night bullets shattered the illusion of safety and exposed the darkness within. Yet today, the hospital stood renewed. Not perfect, but healing like a wound that had finally begun to close. Teresa stood at the entrance, taking in the familiar scent of antiseptic and coffee that always lingered in the air. The faint hum of monitors and the shuffle of nurses' shoes echoed like a heartbeat through the building. Once these sounds reminded her of trauma. Now they felt like music. She had returned, but not as the same woman who had left on a stretcher months before. Gone was the uncertainty, the fear. In its place stood quiet determination. The hospital board had called her back, not out of sympathy but respect. Her courage, her integrity, her willingness to face truth even when it came at the cost of blood. Those were the qualities St. Alden Memorial needed to rebuild itself. Welcome back, Chief Reed, said Dr. Patel, smiling as he extended his hand. The title still felt surreal. Chief of Staff. Just a year ago, she had been another name on the duty roster, a nurse with tired feet and a heart full of purpose. Now, she carried the weight of leadership, guiding the very institution that had once nearly lost her. Teresa smiled faintly. It's good to be home. Her first day as chief was not marked by ceremony or applause. She had asked for none of that. Instead, she walked the halls quietly, meeting eyes, shaking hands, offering words of reassurance. Many of the staff still carried the emotional scars of that terrible night. The memory of sirens and shouting lingered in corners no cleaning could erase. But when they saw Teresa alive, composed, and standing tall, something in them stirred. Hope returned. She stopped by the hallway where it had happened. The one that once rare of fear and gunpowder. The floor had been replaced. The walls repainted. The lights softened. But what drew her eyes was the plaque beside the nurse's station. The Teresa Reed wing dedicated to courage, integrity, and the pursuit of truth. She touched the metal plate lightly, a small smile playing on her lips. It wasn't pride she felt. It was gratitude. Gratitude for survival, for second chances for the people who had refused to give up on her. As Chief of Staff, Teresa's first mission was simple yet revolutionary. Rebuild trust, not through words, but through transparency. The hospital's reputation had suffered, but she knew healing reputations worked much like healing bodies. It required honesty, patience, and care. She implemented new systems for financial oversight, ensuring no one person could ever hold unchecked power again. Every department was now accountable, every budget open to review. In meetings, she spoke not with authority, but with conviction. We're not here to bury what happened, she told her staff one morning. We're here to learn from it, to make sure St. Alban Memorial stands for something unshakable. Truth, compassion, and courage. Her words carried weight. The same people who once whispered in fear now listened with admiration. Even the board members, once aloof and untouchable, began to echo her principles. Slowly, the hospital transformed, not just in policy, but in spirit. Patients began to notice the difference, too. Staff morale improved. Departments communicated better. For the first time in years, St. Alban Memorial was more than just a hospital. It was a community bound by resilience. But leadership came with its own shadows. Late at night, when the halls were quiet, Teresa sometimes found herself staring out of her office window, the city lights shimmering beyond the glass. She thought of Dr. Warren, not with anger, but with reflection. His actions had nearly destroyed everything, but they had also forced the truth into the open. His downfall had made space for something better to rise. Maybe that's what tragedy does, she murmured one night. It breaks you open just enough to let the light in. Her reforms extended beyond administration. Teresa championed ethical health care initiatives, programs to ensure that patients in financial hardship still receive care, scholarships for nurses pursuing higher education, and counseling services for medical staff coping with trauma. She knew firsthand the weight of invisible wounds. Healing wasn't just physical, it was emotional, spiritual. Word of her leadership spread beyond the hospital. News outlets that once told her story of survival now returned to tell a different one, a story of transformation. Articles called her the nurse who rebuilt the system and the heart behind St. Alban's renewal. But for Teresa, the attention was never the goal. She preferred quiet victories, a young nurse smiling again, a patient discharged in good health, a staff meeting ending in laughter instead of tension. The hospital began hosting community outreach programs. Teresa personally attended the first one, standing before a crowd of students and health workers. Every great institution is built on people who refuse to look away from the truth, she told them. I didn't ask to be in the position I'm in. None of us ask for the storms that test us, but we can choose what we build once they pass. Her words resonated far beyond those walls. Months rolled into a year, and Teresa's leadership reshaped the culture of St. Alban Memorial entirely. The dark days were not forgotten, but they no longer define the hospital. Instead, it was defined by the courage of its people, by the reminder that even in brokenness, something extraordinary could grow. On the anniversary of her return, the board held a small ceremony in the newly renovated wing. Doctors, nurses, and patients filled the room, their applause soft but full of warmth. Dr. Patel stood at the podium, his voice proud. "Teresa Reed is more than a survivor," he said. "She is proof that strength isn't the absence of pain, but the will to turn pain into purpose." As Teresa stepped forward to speak, the crowd fell silent. She looked out at the faces before her, faces that had seen both horror and hope. "I don't stand here as someone special," she began. "I stand here as someone who got a second chance. This hospital, this place, it gave me my life back. But what matters most is what we do with the lives we're given. So to every nurse, doctor, and patient who walks through these doors, remember, healing isn't about erasing what hurt you. It's about finding meaning in why you survived." The room erupted into quiet applause. Not the loud, fleeting kind that fades after a moment, but the kind that carries emotion. A collective acknowledgement of shared strength. Later, as the event ended, Teresa walked once more through the hall bearing her name. The evening light filtered in through the glass panels, soft and golden. The world felt peaceful, alive. She paused, looking down the corridor that once echoed with gunfire and fear. Now it was filled with laughter, the chatter of nurses, the sound of life continuing. From victim to visionary, it wasn't just her story. It was the story of everyone who had chosen to stand again after being broken. And as she turned toward her office, a quiet smile crossed her lips. The hospital had found its heart again, and so had she. The air in Washington, D.C. shimmered with quiet anticipation. Outside the grand hall of the White House, flags rippled in the early afternoon breeze, their colors vibrant against the pale marble columns. Inside, rows of distinguished guests, military officers, journalists, and citizens filled every seat. The chandeliers above cast a soft golden glow, illuminating the faces of those gathered to witness something extraordinary. At the center of it all sat Teresa Reed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The hum of murmured conversations surrounded her, yet she heard none of it. Her mind was still, her heart steady. She looked down at the simple navy dress she'd chosen, at the faint scars that peeked from beneath her sleeves, reminders of pain, of survival, of everything she had endured. When the President of the United States stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. His voice, calm yet resonant, filled the hall. Today, he began, "We honor those whose courage, integrity, and sacrifice have shaped not only their communities, but the conscience of this nation. And among them is a woman whose story has touched hearts across America, Teresa Reed." Her name echoed through the chamber like a wave. Every person in the room rose to their feet, the sound of applause swelling into a symphony that reverberated through the marble walls. Cameras flashed, but Teresa hardly noticed. Her throat tightened, and for a moment, she found herself back in that hospital corridor. The echo of gunfire, the smell of antiseptic, the taste of fear. Then she blinked, and the present came rushing back. She rose slowly, the movement graceful yet deliberate, and made her way toward the stage. The click of her heels against the polished floor seemed to stretch through time. Each step carried with it the weight of everything she had survived, everything she had fought to change. When she reached the podium, the president met her with a warm smile. "Teresa Reed," he said, holding the small, gleaming medal in his hands. "Your story is one of resilience, truth, and unshakable courage. You faced unimaginable darkness and chose not vengeance, but integrity. You turned pain into purpose and inspired a nation to remember what compassion and justice truly mean." He lifted the Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, and placed it around her neck. The ribbon brushed against her collarbone, and the medal itself caught the light, its golden surface reflecting not grandeur, but grace. For a moment, Teresa stood perfectly still, her eyes glistening. The applause rose again, thunderous this time, but her thoughts were far away. She remembered the long nights in the hospital, the ache of healing, the endless interviews and investigations. She remembered standing in the hallway that bore her name, wondering if she had done enough, if her survival had truly made a difference. Now, as she looked out at the sea of faces, leaders, citizens, strangers, she understood. Every scar had a purpose. Every tear had built something greater than pain. When the applause finally softened, the president gestured for her to speak. Teresa stepped to the podium, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the medal as she gathered her thoughts.
For a moment, she said,
"Nothing. Just breathe." "Thank you," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "This medal may rest on my shoulders, but it belongs to many. To every nurse who works through the night. To every doctor who refuses to give up. To every patient who fights for one more sunrise. And to every person who has ever been afraid, but chose to do the right thing anyway." Her words carried an honesty that silenced even the clicking cameras. "When I was lying in that hospital bed," she continued, "I thought my story had ended. I thought courage was about strength, about not breaking. But I learned that real courage is what happens after you've broken and still find a way to stand. I wasn't brave because I wasn't afraid. I was brave because I was terrified, and I kept going anyway." She glanced down at the medal once more. It shimmered under the stage lights, not as a symbol of power, but as a reflection of something deeper. "This isn't about recognition," she said softly. "It's about responsibility. I didn't survive so people would remember my name. I survived so no one else would have to go through what I did in silence. This medal reminds me that truth, no matter how painful, is always worth fighting for." The audience sat utterly still. Even the reporters, usually restless, were motionless, caught in the gravity of her sincerity. Teresa took a slow breath, her voice gaining quiet strength. "We live in a world that sometimes rewards silence over honesty, comfort over conscience. But I stand here today because I chose to speak, and because so many others stood beside me when I did. Change doesn't come from grand gestures. It starts in the smallest moments when one person decides that fear won't win." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. She smiled faintly, her eyes finding the faces of familiar figures. Dr. Patel sitting near the front, members of the hospital board who had rebuilt alongside her. A few nurses from St. Alban Memorial who had traveled miles just to be there. Their eyes shone with pride. "I used to think the darkest night I ever faced was the night I was shot," Teresa said quietly. But it wasn't. The darkest night was the one that followed. The one filled with doubt, guilt, and the question of whether I could ever trust again. The light didn't come all at once. It came from people who believed, from honesty, from choosing hope again and again. Her final words lingered in the stillness. "So, if my story means anything, let it mean this. Light can prevail even in the darkest corridors. And sometimes one act of courage is all it takes to change everything." As she stepped back, the audience erupted once more into applause. Not polite, restrained applause, but something deeper. A standing ovation that filled the hall with raw emotion. Some wiped tears from their eyes. Others simply clapped until their hands hurt. The president extended his hand again, but Teresa shook her head lightly and instead offered a small bow of respect before returning to her seat. She wasn't there for accolades. She was there as a reminder to herself and to the world that resilience was not born from glory, but from survival and purpose. When the ceremony ended and the guests began to file out, Teresa lingered for a moment near the stage. The room had quieted, the echoes of applause fading into the marble corridors. She looked down at the medal once more, its weight solid against her chest. It didn't feel like a trophy. It felt like a promise, reminder that her story was no longer just hers. It belonged to every person who had ever faced darkness and chosen light. To every survivor who had rebuilt from the ruins, to every soul who believed that truth, even when costly, was worth everything. As she walked out into the crisp afternoon air, the crowd outside cheered, waving flags and holding signs that read, "Thank you, Teresa." She smiled humbly. the corners of her eyes crinkling with warmth. The sunlight caught the metal of freedom as she stepped down the White House stairs, and for a brief moment, it gleamed so brightly it looked alive, like a star reborn after a long night. Teresa lifted her face to the sky, breathed in deeply, and whispered to herself, "For the truth. Always for the truth." Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Tell us what you think about how it all ended and what part moved you the most. Rate the story on a scale of 1 to 10, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your thoughts and feedback help keep stories like this